you see that video? I mean, it's bananas.
I'll tell you why this is particularly close to my heart, because to coin a favourite phrase of the left wing, it has been my lived experience over the past 3 years or so that a lot of crimes happening against women especially seem to be committed by people who aren't from this country. I've been followed home with a man in one of those Afghan kolpol hats chuntering away in some language all the way to my front door. I had to hide in my neighbour's house and pretend I didn't live in my house because he was lurking around outside trying to do indecent things to himself. That's right. I've also had my phone robbed off me by a Roma woman with a scarf on. And I'm like, what are we doing here? Who are these people? Why are we importing all this stuff? I cannot walk down the streets where I live anymore without weird men leering at me, making comments. Look, I'm not one of these Me Too movement women. When it was builders wolf whistling from vans, I don't care. Sometimes it brightens up your day. Because what they don't do is they don't get into your personal space. They don't trail you. They don't physically approach you. They don't follow you to your front door. It's a very different sort of more harmless thing, a wolf whistle, than some of the stuff I'm being subjected to now. And some of the stuff my best mate who lives around the corner, again, her lived experience. Also, guess what? A woman with long blonde hair. She has 4 teenage daughters. All of them now have at some point been sexually assaulted. They've been groped. They have been followed. They are scared living in London. What is going on? So I am going to keep talking about this. I don't care if people turn around and goes, you're a racist, because my safety and the safety of women in this country is paramount. That is way more important than offending certain communities who, quite frankly, have men with medieval values when it comes to women, and I ain't standing for it.
Or is he a dead PM walking?
I think the only thing that Keir Starmer can look forward to, really, Martin, is that look behind himself, actually, is his own backbenchers and possibly his frontbenchers. I can't see anybody replacing him, to be honest. At one time there was muted about Angela Rayner replacing him. She's sort of gone missing. West Streeting is sort of slithering about in the background. He could be ready to launch the old dagger in the back, but I'm surprised. He said he had a popularity rating of 11%. I'm surprised it's as high as that at the moment, Martin, because everywhere you go in this country, as a politician, people talk to me wherever I go, and this man is despised. I think he's the most despised Prime Minister in history. I think he's cowardly. He U-turns on everything. He bends to his backbenchers all the time just to save his own skin. He's a dead man walking. I think his time is probably up.
The streets of London are burning. Police barriers smashed. Westminster under siege. And in the most stunning political collapse in British history, Keir Starmer's government has just fallen apart in front of the entire world. What you're about to hear isn't speculation, it's not rumour. This is happening right now. And the shockwaves are tearing through every corner of the United Kingdom. Millions of Brits are demanding answers. The establishment is in complete chaos, and what happens in the next 72 hours will decide the fate of this nation. But here's what they don't want you to know. This didn't start yesterday. This catastrophe has been building for months, and the evidence they tried to bury is finally exploding into the open. Stick with me, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about British politics. The moment Keir Starmer walked into Parliament this morning, he knew his time was finished. You could see it in his face, that hollow look of a man who's lost control of everything. The chamber was packed, absolutely rammed with MPs from every party, and the atmosphere was electric with rage. But this wasn't just another rowdy session, this was a political execution. Conservative MPs were on their feet screaming for his resignation. Reform UK members were demanding immediate elections. And here's the part that should terrify Labour supporters. Even his own backbenchers were turning against him. We're talking about Labour MPs, the people who are supposed to have his back, openly calling for him to step down. When your own team abandons you in the middle of the battle, you know it's over. The breaking point came at 11:23 this morning when the Speaker of the House made an unprecedented announcement. Emergency votes were being called, multiple motions of no confidence were on the table, and the parliamentary schedule was being completely torn up. In over 3 decades of covering British politics, veteran journalists were saying they'd never seen anything like this. The government wasn't just losing a vote, it was disintegrating in real time on live television. Social media exploded instantly Within minutes, the hashtags were trending worldwide, and British citizens were watching their government collapse on their phones while sitting in cafes, on buses, in their offices. This is the digital age. You can't hide political carnage anymore. Everyone sees everything as it happens. But let me take you back 3 months, because that's when the cracks really started to show. Starmer's approval ratings had been sliding steadily since he took office, but in October something shifted dramatically. A series of scandals erupted, one after another, like dominoes falling, and each one was worse than the last. First came the revelation about undisclosed meetings with foreign lobbyists. Then the leaked documents showing his inner circle knew about economic problems they were publicly denying. And then the absolute bombshell evidence emerged that key policy decisions were being made based on polling data rather than what was actually good for the country. The British people aren't stupid. They could smell the dishonesty from miles away, and trust in Starmer's government went into free fall. The opposition smelled blood in the water, and they went in for the kill. Rishi Sunak, who many had written off as yesterday's news, came roaring back with some of the most devastating speeches of his career. He stood in Parliament and systematically dismantled every promise Starmer had made, every claim his government had put forward, every excuse they tried to use, and he had receipts, actual documents, actual evidence, actual quotes that Starmer couldn't deny. The Conservative benches erupted with every point, and you could see Labour MPs sinking lower and lower in their seats. They knew they had no defence. They knew their leader had led them into a disaster, and they knew the public was watching every second of their humiliation. Then Nigel Farage entered the arena and absolutely detonated what was left of Starmer's credibility. Farage had been quietly building a case for weeks, gathering testimony from whistleblowers, collecting evidence of governmental incompetence, documenting every broken promise and every failed policy. When he finally stood up in Parliament, he didn't just criticise the government, he presented what amounted to a prosecution case. He had former civil servants on record saying they'd been ordered to hide negative economic data. He had leaked emails showing ministers contradicting their public statements in private, and he had polling that proved the British people had completely lost faith in the current leadership. It wasn't a political attack, it was a systematic destruction backed by hard evidence that nobody could refute. The chamber fell silent as he spoke, and you could feel the weight of his words crushing what remained of Starmer's authority. This wasn't just bad politics anymore. This was the government being exposed as fundamentally dishonest with the people it was supposed to serve. The economic numbers that dropped last week were the final nail in the coffin. Britain's economy had contracted for the third consecutive quarter. Unemployment was climbing faster than any point since the financial crisis of 2008, and inflation was stubbornly refusing to come down, despite all the government's promises. But here's what made it catastrophic for Starmer. His own Chancellor had been telling the public just 2 weeks earlier that growth was around the corner and jobs were being created. The statistics prove that was a complete lie. Business owners across the country were shutting their doors. Families were struggling to pay their heating bills as winter approached, and the government's response was to keep spinning the same tired talking points that nobody believed anymore. The disconnect between what Starmer's ministers were saying and what ordinary people were experiencing in their daily lives had become so extreme that it was insulting. You can't tell someone their situation is improving when they're choosing between feeding their kids and heating their home. The protests started small, but they grew with terrifying speed. It began in Manchester, with a few hundred people gathering outside the town hall, demanding the government address the cost of living crisis. Within days, it had spread to Birmingham, Liverpool, Newcastle, Cardiff and Edinburgh. By the end of the week, over 100,000 people had taken to the streets of London in what became the largest demonstration against a sitting government in a modern British history. These weren't professional protesters or political activists. These were teachers and nurses and factory workers and shop owners, regular people who'd never been to a protest in their lives, but who were so angry and so desperate that they felt they had no choice. They carried signs reading "Starmer out" and "We demand elections" and "You work for us." The police were overwhelmed, completely unable to manage the sheer numbers. and several major streets in central London had to be shut down entirely. Television cameras captured the scale of it all, the sea of people stretching from Parliament Square all the way to Trafalgar Square, and the message was unmistakable. The British people were done with Keir Starmer and they wanted him gone immediately. Inside Westminster, the panic was reaching fever pitch. Labour whips were running from office to office, desperately trying to shore up support, but they were fighting a losing battle. Backbench MPs were fielding thousands of angry calls and emails from their constituents, demanding they take action against Starmer. Several junior ministers quietly submitted their resignations, not wanting to go down with the ship. Senior cabinet members were reportedly having emergency meetings without Starmer present, discussing whether they should force him out themselves before the situation got even worse. The party was eating itself alive and everyone knew it. Political journalists were reporting that some Labour MPs were already in secret talks with opposition parties about forming a unity government, a move that would have been unthinkable just months ago. The walls were closing in from every direction and there was nowhere left to run. Then came the intelligence that changed everything. A massive leak hit the press, revealing that Starmer's government had been briefed months ago about the economic crisis that was coming. They knew the numbers were going to be terrible. They knew businesses were going to collapse. They knew unemployment was going to surge, and they made a deliberate decision to hide it from the public. Internal memos showed ministers discussing how to manage the messaging, how to delay the bad news until after key votes, how to spin the narrative to minimise political damage. They chose their political survival over being honest with the people they were supposed to serve. When those documents went public, the reaction was thermonuclear. Even traditional Labour supporters, people who'd voted for the party their entire lives, were calling radio shows absolutely furious at the betrayal. The trust was shattered completely and irreparably. You can survive policy failures, you can survive economic downturns, but you cannot survive being exposed as liars who deliberately misled the entire nation about matters affecting their livelihoods and their families. The morning of the parliamentary showdown, Starmer looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His attempts to rally his party had failed spectacularly. His public addresses had been met with open mockery, and the polls showed his approval rating had crashed to levels never seen before for a sitting Prime Minister. Opposition leaders smelled total victory, and they were going in for the kill without mercy. The motion of no confidence was formally introduced and the debate began, but it wasn't really a debate anymore. It was a public dismantling of everything Starmer had claimed to stand for when he took office. The chamber erupted into absolute chaos as speaker after speaker rose to condemn Starmer's handling of the crisis. Conservative MPs tore into his economic record with surgical precision, citing specific policy failures and broken promises that had left British families worse off than they were a year ago. They brought up the energy crisis that his government had failed to address, the small business closures that were accelerating under his watch, and the complete mismanagement of public services that were now on the verge of collapse. Every attack was backed by data, by official reports, by the government's own statistics that contradicted everything Starmer had been telling the public. The Labour benches sat in stone-faced silence because there was nothing they could say in defence. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, and every person in that chamber knew it. The television cameras captured it all, broadcasting the humiliation to millions of viewers across the country who were watching history unfold in real time. Reform UK members delivered some of the most scathing attacks, pointing out that Starmer had campaigned on being different from the establishment politicians of the past, on bringing honesty and transparency to government, on putting working people first. Instead, he had become exactly what he claimed to oppose: a political insider more concerned with protecting his position than serving the public interest. They read out quotes from his campaign speeches and contrasted them with his actions as Prime Minister, showing a pattern of hypocrisy so blatant it was damning. They highlighted how he'd promised to fix the immigration system but had overseen record levels of illegal crossings, how he'd vowed to reduce waiting times in the National Health Service, but those times had actually increased, how he'd pledged to bring down crime, but violent incidents were surging in major cities. Every single major promise had been broken. Every commitment had been abandoned, and the British people were living with the consequences of his failures every single day. Liberal Democrat MPs focused on the constitutional implications of what had been revealed in the leaked documents. They argued that a government that deliberately withholds critical economic information from Parliament and the public has violated the fundamental principles of democratic accountability. They cited legal experts who suggested that some of the actions taken by Starmer's ministers might actually constitute misconduct in public office, a serious charge that could have legal ramifications beyond just political consequences. The argument was devastating because it elevated the issue beyond mere policy disagreements into questions about the integrity of British democracy itself. If a government can lie to the people about the state of the economy, if ministers can conspire to hide information that affects every household in the nation, then what does democratic governance even mean anymore? The questions hung in the air like an indictment, and nobody from the Labour benches even attempted to answer them because there was no good answer to give. Even members of Starmer's own party began to turn on him publicly. Several backbench Labour MPs stood up and gave speeches that were more damaging than anything the opposition could have said. These were people who had supported Starmer, who had campaigned for him, who had defended him through previous controversies, and now they were saying enough was enough. One MP from a northern constituency spoke about the emails and calls flooding her office from constituents who felt betrayed and abandoned by a government they had voted for in good faith. She talked about families losing their homes, about pensioners choosing between food and heating, about young people with no hope for the future, and she said she could no longer stand by a leader who had allowed this to happen. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke, and the silence in the chamber was deafening. Another Labour MP, a former minister who had resigned weeks earlier, delivered a blistering assessment of Starmer's leadership style, describing a prime minister who refused to listen to warnings, who surrounded himself with yes men, who made decisions based on political calculation rather than what was right for the country. The testimony from inside his own party was absolutely crushing because it confirmed everything the opposition had been saying. Outside Parliament, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The protests had grown larger and more intense, with demonstrators now completely surrounding the building. Police reinforcements had been called in from across London, but they were struggling to maintain order as the crowd swelled beyond anything they had prepared for. There were reports of minor clashes breaking out, of barriers being pushed back, of the anger threatening to boil over into something more serious. The images being broadcast on every news channel showed a nation in crisis, a government under siege, and a political system that appeared to be breaking down before everyone's eyes. International media had picked up the story, and it was leading news broadcasts around the world, showing Britain in a state of political turmoil unseen in generations. The embarrassment on the world stage only added to the pressure crushing down on Starmer from every possible direction. The final votes were called and the atmosphere in Parliament became suffocating with tension. MPs filed through the division lobbies as the entire nation watched and waited for the results that would determine the fate of the government. Political analysts on every news channel were saying this was the most significant moment in British politics since the Brexit referendum, perhaps even more consequential, because this wasn't just about policy direction, this was about whether the government itself could survive. The numbers were being tallied, and rumours were already circulating that the result was going to be devastating for Starmer. Journalists were receiving text messages from sources inside the chamber suggesting that dozens of Labour MPs had voted against their own Prime Minister, an act of political rebellion that would normally be career suicide, but in this case was seen as the only way to salvage what remained of the party's credibility. The counting seemed to take forever, every second dragging out as millions of people across Britain held their breath waiting for the end. Constitutional experts were immediately called upon by broadcasters to explain what happens next, because this situation was so rare that most people had never lived through anything like it. The government had fallen, the Prime Minister had been defeated, and Britain was now facing a period of political uncertainty that could last weeks or even months. Stock markets reacted immediately with sharp movements as investors processed the instability, and the pound fluctuated wildly against other currencies as traders tried to predict what would come next. Starmer's statement following the vote was brief and bitter. He stood at the dispatch box looking haggard and defeated, his voice lacking any of the confidence he had projected when he first took office. He said he would respect the will of Parliament and would be tendering his resignation to the King immediately. He attempted to defend his record, claiming that his government had faced unprecedented challenges and had done its best under difficult circumstances. But even as he spoke, you could see MPs on both sides shaking their heads in disgust. His words rang hollow after everything that had been exposed, after all the lies and deceptions that had been laid bare for everyone to see. He tried to maintain some dignity, but it was impossible given the scale of his defeat and the manner in which his government had collapsed. When he finished speaking and left the chamber, it was clear that his political career was over, finished not just as Prime Minister, but likely forever as a significant force in British politics. The man who had promised to transform the country had instead been consumed by scandals of his own making and rejected utterly by the very Parliament he had sought to lead. The immediate aftermath saw absolute pandemonium both inside Westminster and across the country. Opposition parties immediately began positioning themselves for what comes next, with emergency meetings being called to discuss forming a new government. The Conservative Party leadership was in intense discussions about whether to push for immediate general elections or attempt to form a coalition government that could provide stability in the short term. Reform UK was demanding that the people be given their say through elections as soon as possible, arguing that the entire political establishment had failed and needed to be swept away. Liberal Democrats were exploring all options and refusing to commit to any particular path forward. Meanwhile, Labour was in complete meltdown, with different factions blaming each other for the catastrophe and already beginning the inevitable leadership battle that would determine the future direction of the party. Senior Labour figures were giving competing interviews to the media, some trying to distance themselves from Starmer, while others attempted to defend the record of the government, creating a chaotic mess of contradictory messages that only reinforced how completely the party had lost its way. The British public reaction was a mixture of satisfaction, anger, and deep concern about what happens next. Social media exploded with commentary from every possible perspective, with hashtags about Starmer's resignation trending worldwide for hours. Supporters of the opposition parties were celebrating what they saw as accountability finally being delivered and a failed government being removed from power. But there was also widespread anxiety about the instability and uncertainty that now faced the country. Britain was without a functioning government at a time of serious economic challenges, international pressures and social tensions that needed addressing urgently. The questions everyone was asking were who would lead the country next, when would elections be held, and could whoever took over actually solve the massive problems that Starmer's government had left behind. Street celebration broke out in some areas where opposition to Starmer had been strongest, but in other parts of the country there was a sombre recognition that while one failed leader had been removed, the underlying crises facing Britain remained unsolved and perhaps even worse than before. The fall of Starmer's government wasn't the end of Britain's troubles. It was potentially just the beginning of an even more turbulent period ahead. What happens in the coming days and weeks will determine whether this political earthquake leads to renewal and reform or descends into prolonged chaos that damages the country for years to come.